Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've just made a little bit of a PowerPoint to go over the main issues that are included in the Clean Water Reform proposals, just as a bit of a reminder, but the paper has considerably more detail than what the PowerPoint presentation has got. But just as a reminder, the government's freshwater reform program, at the moment we're at the Clean Water Package part of the program, following on from quite a lot of work by the government since 2009 in freshwater reform, with in 2017 onwards several other elements of the reform package programmed. So the key components this time round are around a new target for swimmability of rivers, with new information being provided about that, and some changes to the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, including some specific ones around a swimmable objective and policy, the clarification of maintain and improve overall water quality, the meaning and effect of Te Mana o Te Wai, the impact on economic opportunities, some more clarity around coastal lakes and lagoons, and further policy on exceptions to the national bottom lines, and some further monitoring requirements. As well, the Clean Water Package also has some funding available, and you've received advice about that separately, and some new details around national stock exclusion regulations. So in terms of swimmability, the government is looking at increasing the amount of time that rivers are swimmable and has included that as a national objective. The concept is broadly supported, but there is a little bit more attention to detail required in relation to the implementation and execution. There is actually no bottom line included in the NPS FM, and it's more the government is taking more of an action plan approach. There is a little bit of concern around the tensions that might arise with this approach in relation to the processes involved in implementing the National Policy Statement, particularly in terms of timeframes and RMA and LGA processes, including plan change processes, and the possible impact that's got on both processes and staff resources in meeting that particular aim of the government. In addition, there are further technical specifications for monitoring and reporting that are of particular concern to some of our technical staff, and Anna Marawa-Smith is in attendance as well to answer any questions around the technical difficulties that are apparent in the NPS amendments. Some of the particular ones are around the lack of coherence between the NPS requirements and our existing monitoring programs, both for state of the environment monitoring and our bathing water program, which have significant implications for our resources, both dollars and staff time. But there's also difficulty in accurately reporting our progress against the government objective for 90% swimmability that need to be addressed to make it more workable. We did note that there is increasing detail at the national level and specification, and one of the aspects is in relation to the dissolved nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus objectives. There is, it's clear that they are important in managing water, but there is a bit of a concern that a focus on single attributes might divert attention to a more integrated and coherent package to dealing with water quality problems or ecosystem health. MCI, we already monitor for MCI and are actively involved in national programs for standardising that measure. That's the macroinvertebrate health of water bodies. So that doesn't add anything in particular to our burden at the moment in terms of monitoring. We are a little bit concerned about the requirement for measuring health of Indigenous aquatic species, and that there is no specific guidance as to what that might include, and that may also have quite significant implications for council resourcing. And of course the need for Mataronga Māori monitoring as well, which also is consistent with where the council is going and is evidenced by the Tuki plan change and work in that space. There are perceptions that the economic well-being of communities is not adequately accounted for in the NPS currently. The NPS does focus on aquatic ecosystem as a national value, but an observation is that both the NPS FM and Section 32 analysis already require cost benefits to be accounted for, and that the new text proposed by the government unnecessarily complicates that assessment. And significance of values could still be assessed in their own terms to aid value-based decision making. In relation to stock exclusion, the council previously supported the principle, supported measures to regulate stock exclusion in principle, but pointed out difficulties around implementation of a national regulation, and that we have practical experience that demonstrates the complexity in interpretation and compliance at a local level in relation to the Tuki plan change, and that the level of detail and the number of variables that the government proposes in its national regulation are of concern in adding to that interpretation and compliance complexity. And the government also introduces fines for non-compliance that are actually inconsistent with the current regulations for infringements across all parts of the RMA, including discharges that are of note, perhaps not concern, but certainly of note. The paper in front of you suggests a possible alternative approach to managing stock exclusion that reflects or accounts for some of the difficulties that we've experienced through the Tuki plan change implementation, and that we could support bottom lines for stock exclusion that are values-based and perhaps are particularly targeted at things like wetlands, lakes, coastal margins and waters where water conservation orders apply. But instead of having a national regulation for the rest of the rivers, to require regional councils to adopt stock exclusion provisions specifically as they implement the NPS for their catchments, and that it enables local solutions and local timeframes to be enabled. And that would reflect what is evident through the tank plan change process, is that the landowners are willing to look at local solutions and timeframes to meet objectives in a way that would be undermined by a national stock exclusion regulation. So in terms of next steps for the submission, this is just a preliminary draft for your input and feedback, and we will look to have a redrafted submission available for the agenda papers on the 19th of April for the council to consider at their next meeting at the 26th. We have a fairly short deadline for the submission, being the end of April. So if there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
I've got one. This submission that's being made, is it being made on behalf of the council, or is it being made on behalf of the JPC?
It would be made on behalf of the council.
I have an issue with that. Any submission is a position statement, and any position statement that is not does not take into consideration the co-management aspects of the region, I don't think it should go. I believe that the values of tangata whenua need to be incorporated in this submission, and it's not our fault that the time frames are tight, but I would like to see more discussion on this, and if we have to ask for an extension or to happen, then so be it.
Chair, if I could comment, consistent with the Regional Planning Committee Act, it's certainly my interpretation that given that this is a matter that is germane to regional resource management planning, that while, yes, the submission must come from the council, it will be on the basis of advice from the Regional Planning Committee, which is why it's before you today. So there was every intention to seek your views and for you to make recommendations in relation to this, which is again why it's a decision item, through to the council to make. So as with all of the statutory functions that the council holds, they must be, if you like, determined by the council itself. It does so on the advice of the Regional Planning Committee, so with respect to RMA planning issues. So this committee's discussion today is important and substantive, and one of the reasons why we decided not to defer or postpone this meeting or cancel this meeting, which could have been an option, given that as it is apparent to some members of the committee that it's a relatively light agenda, that this is a very important set of issues that warrants due discussion. So we had every expectation that today there would be a substantive discussion about all of the elements that reside within this submission, and that we would be taking the views of today's discussion and committee through to council for recommendations.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now lost my place here. The discussion in this paper under freshwater management, which is items 42 and following for a bit to 50 or so. I want to make sure I understand what is actually being said here by the staff. We have a concern that the government is being too prescriptive about specific nutrient targets or limits that would have to be met, that we seem to feel would not necessarily be the best reflectors of what should be controlled to achieve water quality improvement. Is that basically what we're saying? And if I understand that issue, as it got approached in, for example, Plan Change 6, the issue was, well, okay, maybe something like MCI is a better measure of overall ecosystem health, but we can't instruct a farmer to do anything about improving MCI specifically. But what we can instruct a farmer is about use of fertilizers or whatever, or nitrate leaching or et cetera from their property, hence a farm plan, which is supposed to address those issues and mitigate those. And now, and maybe I can knock off the added item on the agenda. We now have some environmental groups who are saying, well, farm plans, as those are being administered in the Horizon situation, are not actually being written in a way that would achieve the mitigation requirements that the one plan imposes on them. So it seems to me that there's a bit of issue here. And item 46, we recommend expressing reservations about the growing degree of prescription and risk of reductionism in how councils manage for freshwater outcomes. So I'm a little worried about that language if it is meant to be suggesting we go in a direction where we are not actually looking at actual activities on properties that can be where behavior can be prescribed and will have a positive impact on the overall environment. So what is it actually that we are saying is a better approach to this? Given that the Environment Court seems to the other day have said, sided with the environmental groups on this issue, saying that the plans that are being approved by that council aren't aren't getting the job done. And we seem to be headed down that same track. We as a council are saying farm plans are the keystone, well, they already are the centerpiece of Plan Change 6, and certainly discussion to date in the tank process has been that some approach to farm plans will be a keystone element of what we do in all of those catchments. So our position on whether what these are, what they should include, what they should prescribe or not prescribe, is pretty much the heart of the matter, isn't it? A lot of questions there.
And perhaps I can most usefully describe where the concern is arising with an actual example, in that in the Karamu catchment it's recognised as not being one of our showcase water bodies, and it does need an awful lot of work. There are high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus in that water body, but the technical advice is that in order to get most effective use of resources, we concentrate on the macrophyte growth through shading, which then assists the improvement of the water quality by improving the oxygen content, which will then improve the aquatic ecosystem values for macroinvertebrates and fish. We know that the nitrogen also needs attention, but if the continued focus on attribute states is what drives our decision making, we get diverted from looking at the bigger picture and the more integrated approach. So that's really where we were coming from. It's not saying that farmers don't need to change, but it's giving communities and councils the ability to look at what gives a maximum effect for the resources available.
I understand what you're saying about the holistic approach, and that different water bodies might require different overall approaches, but it still comes back then to achieve that, what actually would we be thinking we would put in a relevant farm plan, or require in a relevant farm plan to meet that objective, if it is not limiting one of those outputs, let's say, that or actions that a farmer has some control over.
The integrated approach to the plan itself would feed into where the effort needs to be made on a farm scale as well. So there should be some kind of connection between where we're focusing the plan's attention and where farmers and landowners need to focus their attention. So well, we haven't come up with what the farm plan needs to say, but that is certainly going to be part of how we construct the requirements within a farm plan.
Chair, perhaps I could just add that, I think this section talks specifically to the increasing desire to have more prescriptive numbers in the National Objectives Framework, in the National Policy Statement around nutrients, particularly for rivers. And this is a matter that's exercised the National Objectives Framework reference group in law for a number of years. But the reality is that the technical advice from the science panels convened from New Zealand's best and brightest around this is that you can't write a national figure for nutrients for rivers. But it's not to say that it's not important that regionally and by catchments that you do it. And so the focus is becoming more about describing the need to do that, and then describing or prescribing a process for councils to go away and do that work and then integrate it into its regional planning processes. So it's absolutely about saying that this stuff is important and it must be considered on a catchment by catchment basis, but no one size fits all, if you like. And that the delivery then of those numbers, or the implementation of those numbers, will come through farm plans and nutrient budgets and those sorts of things. And that's critically important in terms of achieving them in time in each catchment, but it's not about a single number for the country, and that's I guess where the LAWF discussion had got to, is that you can't do that, and it's problematic. Technically, you can't do it, but we want to make sure that communities know they should be talking about this stuff and making some decisions around what's fit for purpose for their catchments, and then writing it in to their plans and ensuring that it's delivered or implemented effectively in time to achieve the freshwater objectives. So I think this is intended to try and reflect that. It's not taking away or dumbing it down. It's just saying, let's not be drawn into this more nationally prescriptive approach around numbers.
Just one last, and I appreciate that set of comments as well. To me, the devil will be in the detail of what we actually put in our submission, and I will be looking to see that we don't express what you've just expressed in a way that makes it sound like in any way, shape, or form we feel we should be relaxing what the government is perhaps clumsily trying to achieve, but so we can raise our sort of technical questions about it. But I think the principles that we stand for in our submission should be very clearly articulated and pretty strongly stated in terms of what we want to achieve in terms of water quality here. So.
In looking at what we have before us, I would say that the swimmability part should be expressed as maybe a starting point, because for Māori we want the waters to be drinkable, and that's a national consideration. It's not just in our area. The other thing is we do have responsibilities already, and there are things we can do to improve our freshwater issues. I do have a concern in regard to the policy, and that the main focus is on the rivers and rather than like the tributaries. It's the tributaries that generally run through the farms, and a lot of the detrimental aspects, I suppose, to water quality happens in those areas. And I'm speaking from the perspective also of a person who's charged with the responsibility of managing 5 farms. So, and we have made an effort to fence off all the tributaries on our farms, and if we can do it, we've done over 33 kilometres of fencing on streams and tributaries. If we can do it, other people can do it. Kia ora.
I do have some comments to make about process, but maybe I can come to that at the end, just picking up on some of James's comments. But I did have some questions for Mary Ann. We are proposing a couple of submissions, and I'm referring to the submission box just above paragraph 50 in our papers, which is page 14. Just in there, we say further clarity about what is meant by monitoring measures of health of indigenous flora and fauna is required, including restricting the requirement to aquatic species. I wanted to check with you, Mary Ann, why would we be making that submission? It's really just to make sure that the requirements under this NPS don't extend over terrestrial biodiversity as well. Just a clarification about the scope. I'm all right now? Yeah, it sounded a bit funny. The reason I raised that question is because in speaking with a couple of whānau handlers last night, including one who's an ornithologist, bird person, and another one who's a marine biologist, we were talking about inanga species, whitebait, and we were talking about indigenous native ducks and other bird species which rely on vegetation adjacent to our rivers and streams, but that vegetation would not be considered
aquatic. So I have a concern that by restricting the requirement to aquatic species, we're cutting out those species which are actually vital to aquatic species thriving.
It's a good point, and we could perhaps rephrase it so that it's in relation to species that are dependent on aquatic ecosystems.
And that would be something I'd like to explore a bit more once I've got a bit more time to talk to these people about it, and perhaps with you, Marianne.
Mm-hmm.
The other one was Mātauranga Māori, which is the next submission point. Requirements for monitoring Mātauranga Māori need to also be subject of the needs of local Māori. Do you just want to give us a bit more detail about that, please, Marianne?
It's reflecting, that Mātauranga Māori needs to be driven by the needs of the local communities, not as a direction by either council or government. So making sure that there is input in terms of what's required and how it's to be done.
Right. So I mean, I welcome the fact, that what you're suggesting is that I guess the onus is on local iwi to define what methods should or could be used to measure these matters. But that raises the question, and perhaps it's picked up in your comment about financial implications, is how are we going to support local iwi to do that?
Yes, it's a good question, and I think it's partly being answered by work being done in implementation of the Tuki Tuki plan change, which we imagine can be transplanted to the wider Hawke's Bay as well. So learnings in the Tuki Tuki in relation to Mātauranga Māori can be transferred.
You're dropping off.
I wouldn't assume that Mātauranga Māori from one hapu in southern Hawke's Bay is the same for hapu in the northern Hawke's Bay, for example.
No, but certainly that discussion also needs to take into account the added financial implications and look for ways to look for efficiencies and effectiveness in looking at Mātauranga Māori.
True. Well, I guess it will come down to a budgeting exercise, but also Mātauranga Māori and waterways relate to all our plan changes. So although we'd be looking at this in relation to this latest report by government, it's an investment worth making is, I guess, my point. And I just want to, I couldn't see it again, Marianne, when I was looking through the paper this morning. Did I read in there somewhere that either the government or we were looking to restrict monitoring to summertime when it's expected that most people will be swimming in the river?
We haven't said that specifically, but we have underlined the difficulty in how the government has expressed its swimmability targets and its monitoring requirements, and the need to make sure that they're aligned in a much better way than they currently seem to be.
Could I also just add to that, and this is a topic of particular interest, I guess, because as written, Appendix 5 would drive quite a significant increase in monitoring for the council. So we want to get clarification on what the intent was, but also that the guidelines, the 2003 microbiological guidelines that the ministry wrote for monitoring our recreational bathing quality are at odds with the way that the ministry's gone around its or developed its swimmability picture. So we want to get clarity on which one we're using, but also that the 2003 guidelines are in a process of active review at the moment and may well change in terms of what those requirements are, and it would be important that the monitoring sort of details that come out of that guideline review are somehow incorporated into this, so we don't end up with kind of two different ways of monitoring the same thing. So it's a bit fluid at the moment. So just responding to that, just to be clear, that the swimmability targets for the NPS are actually written at all flows all year. So that's the approach the government's taken. It said we're going to take water quality throughout the year at all flows and develop the maps, but that the rec bathing beach monitoring that Anna and the team do is restricted to summer months. So there's this disconnect between the two different processes that to us it doesn't make sense. It's like, well, which one are we going to use? What's the right measure? And those are the sorts of questions that we're exploring at the moment.
I just want to bear in mind that let's not make assumptions about people swimming in rivers only in summer, similar to swimming on beaches. So I just wanted to raise that as something we need to manage when we're rationalising what monitoring is best.
Kia ora, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. It was great. Just around the Mātauranga Māori point of view, how we view it as Māori, we're simplistic. When you start bringing the westernised view into MCI counts and all these other models and surveys that are moving forward on this, it gets difficult in the sense of we interpret through tikanga Māori for our values of te wai Māori. And how we value that, or it's not too much a measurement. It's its natural form, how we look at it and how we see it. And when we start digging into this technical interpretation as we move forward, and with our whānau up at Waikare Mona, they are the masters of imbalance with the natural resource when it comes to the word Māori. Māori is a major part of the interconnectedness between Papatūānuku and everything else around. But we don't measure that. We measure that as we look at the people around the table as a human form, not a technical form, because our resources as a natural view through Māori's eyes is how we look after a waterway or how we look after a wetlands or a lake is a reflection of who we are as a hapu, iwi and people. We don't do in the sense of a westernised view when our Pākekes or our kaumātuas are up on the marae doing their whakatauaki, we don't go up to them with a measuring tape and measure them. And this is what I try and say, Māori's view is simple and it's actually really good, and it can actually bring us together through our science views together for the main outcome. And I think we're in a beautiful time where we can express both of those views together, but we don't have to make it too technical, because how we have to go back to our people in a technical sense and explain that, they'll just tell us to get out the door, because that's not their principles and fundamentals around Mātauranga Māori. So it's just a point to have a think of when we do the submission. Kia ora.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, page 14, shallow lakes and icoles. What are icoles?
Oh, my apologies. They're intermittently closing and opening lagoons and intermittently closing and opening lakes and lagoons.
Like whakaki?
Like whakaki.
So whakaki.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Now, the next section, economic well-being, you're saying delete additional references to economic well-being. And as I read your rationale for that, am I correct in saying that you believe the Section 32 analysis provides adequate recognition of economic values? Is that it?
Yes, that's right. Section 32 and also provisions in the National Policy Statement as they are currently, because they require, and I'll read it out, that in considering the development of objectives and limits for water bodies, the following matters at all relevant points in the process need to be considered, and it includes any implications for resource users, people and communities arising from freshwater objectives and associated limits, including implications for actions, investments, ongoing management changes and any social, cultural or economic implications. And I would perhaps suggest that maybe rather than delete additional references to economic wellbeing, that paragraph might be further added to, if necessary, with a reference to the economic implications. But I think the words are already there, and the government is over-icing the cake in terms of this particular provision.
Okay, well, if you're comfortable with that, then I'm happy too. But I mean, in principle, if you're going to have good, effective environmental regulation, then economic and social values need to be considered as well.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'd like to thank you for the report. I quite enjoyed reading that one. I just liked the way it was set out. To me, it was easy, nice and easy to follow. My question is probably following on from Councillor Barker's comments in the previous discussion we're having about oil and gas. Are you conscious or aware of what other regional councils may be submitting, and whether we're all sort of on the same song sheet, or any major differences?
Similar themes are coming through from other councils, although I haven't seen a great number of them, but certainly Greater Wellington and...
Belgium and Z, so I've just sent that to you.
Oh, I haven't seen that one. Yeah. And there was one other. Was it Horizon? It might have been Horizons, have a similar theme. It was Horizons, but I haven't seen any other drafts as yet.
So the sector's really well joined up around this in terms of not necessarily the same submission, but certainly sharing views and perspectives, notwithstanding that each region is free to submit as they see fit. There will be a Local Government New Zealand submission also that kind of looks to integrate as many of those views that are common as possible. The other thing that the sector's working hard on at the moment and is joined up on is dealing with the swimmability targets, which is sort of laid out in paragraphs 11 to 16, which is actually a massive body of work for the sector to describe to the government how it's going to achieve its 80 and 90% targets by 2030 and 2040. So there's a body of work that Liz Lambert and I are involved in, that the Ministry are helping resource to help bring together those regional perspectives and then aggregate them up into a national document. Because it's clear that the government's interested in not only what the regions are doing, but what the country as a whole will be achieving through the regional council initiatives in those timeframes. So we're looking to try and bring that together in a coherent way and avoid a whole lot of duplication and repeated effort. So yeah.
Just a follow-up question from that. In paragraph 4, you talk about regional councils providing information about how swimmability targets can be met. Is that part of what you were just talking about there in terms of what you and Liz are doing together to put together something?
Yeah, so it's effectively two strands, if you like. There's the if we introduce new policies or initiatives to improve swimmability, to reduce the microbiological contamination, stock exclusion, for example, and other initiatives. How much difference does that make, i.e. what sort of improvements do you get with the interventions you bring, and what are the costs of doing that, so that can come back to councils to say, this is how far you can go, these are the costs, do you want to go further, or have we gone too far? And it'll be a bit iterative in terms of how much improvements can we make and what are the costs associated with that, and are we going far enough or too far, or is that about right? So that's the body of work that will be done and coordinated sort of nationally, but through regional inputs. It just avoids us, for example, having to go away and develop our own modelling to do this. MFE have done that. We're going to use their models and their capability and capacity to do that work through the process they're going to run with us. Oh yeah, and absolutely, yeah. So that the time frames are challenging. So by October we have to go back with draft targets, and then March next year the final ones, and obviously that needs to be built into our local government requirements around consultation, because if the council's proposing new targets around achieving these things, and there are costs and those sorts of things associated. That'll need to feed into the long-term plan and be part of your LGA process on consultation with the community, as well as subsequent policy development processes.
Thank you. Still with the swimmability items, this item 28, where the minister is talking about everybody has to get up to 90%. Some regions are as low as 29%, some as high as 99%. Can you remind us where we are in that sweepstakes, and so what's our starting point as we approach this? And is it actually being seriously proposed that we would sort of have inter-regional trade-offs as to we'll be a little more swimmable, you can be a little less, or we can be a little less if you're a little more? Is that what is contemplated here?
So we're 76% at the moment, 76%. So the minister's made it clear that, well, I guess there's a few things to think about in this regard. One is that the targets are not regulation. And you'll note, for those of you who've read the OECD report, that their recommendation is that they are regulation. So the feedback from the minister we're getting is he's happy for it not to be regulation at the moment, as long as the sector can show that they can coherently put forward a picture that sets out how they're going to make improvements, and that he's interested in the national picture, which is an interesting proposition, Councillor, as you say, in terms of who are there winners and losers in that discussion, and he's open to a view that some regions may be able to make improvements more easily than others, and that's where the effort would go. So if you can get wins in one part of the country, that may well make up for areas where it's very problematic and costly to achieve them. So it does throw open that that terminology of trade-off and who has to improve and who's left to stay where they are or not make many gains. He's also very clear that even the regions who are already at the required targets can't stop there, because you'll notice, for those of you that have read the Clean Water paper, that there are bands. So it's an overall assessment based on all of the bands, but he's very interested in getting rivers out of the red or below the bottom line, and those that are in the C and B bands moving up as well. So it's not just because you're at 90 you can rest. It's you need to bring those that are below up into the higher categories in time. So it will be an interesting conversation nationally once the kind of view is on the table and we've done the work to figure out, well, what changes are possible and where, and is it possible that Hawke's Bay, for example, could make a 10% improvement, and that somehow or other offsets Auckland not.
Picking up on James' comments, I know we've had some good discussion already this morning, but I know from the Tanya Te Whenua yesterday there was a lot more drilling down into this that we wanted and need to do. So I just want to come back to your suggestion, Mr. Chair, which I think is a very good one. The submissions are due on the 28th of April, and we have an RCC free on the 3rd of May. My suggestion is that we seek an extension from MFE, which is similar to what we've done before with New Zealand Petroleum and Minerals, I think, where we wanted to have another look at the finalised submission, taking into account further comments during the next period. In that previous submission, I'm sure it was New Zealand Petroleum and Minerals, we brought back a second draft to the Regional Planning Committee for final sign-off. I'm suggesting we do that for this proposal, this round of submissions on this matter, and request that of MFE. It's less than a week for us to be comfortable reviewing the final version, and in the interim work with Tangata Whenua reps to incorporate their comments and have the staff provide to the next RPC meeting on the 3rd of May a further report setting out the draft submission for approval. So that's my request.
On its own, it's only a probably of no value, you probably have to move it as a motion. So that we have some discussion on it.
Chair, could I perhaps just add to that, yes, we would want a recommendation from this committee through to council, and then we'd want the council to then make a resolution at its meeting on the 26th of April to empower the RPC on the 3rd of May to sign off that submission so that it is formally delegated.
So you want to move it as a motion, Karen?
And then stated, so the proposed resolution is that staff contact the Ministry for the Environment and request an extension for submissions to be made from 28th of April to a date following that, so the next RPC agree on the 3rd of May. So requesting an extension for submission to the 3rd of May, the next RPC agree, and to work with Tangata Whenua reps to incorporate our comments on the draft submission, and thirdly to provide to the next RPC agree on the 3rd of May a further report setting out the further draft for approval. Something along those lines.
I don't mind second one yet, and on the basis that we should not be rushed into making decisions.
We should not be rushed into making decisions. We need to consider this issue very seriously. Hawke's Bay is, in my opinion, in a state of crisis, and we're not applying the urgency that we need to this issue. So on that basis, I would second the motion. So
Just a kind of a question, Mr. Chair. Just a question in regard to process around this resolution. Would that come back to council at their May meeting? Is that how that would work?
So, Councillor, what I'm suggesting is that at the 26th of April meeting that council resolves to delegate finalisation of the submission to the RPC's meeting on the 3rd of May. There will be naturally a report back after that to the meeting on the 31st of May, the full council meeting on the 31st of May, but the submission will be lodged at that point and it will have been done under delegated authority by the RPC. So I think with respect to the motion that's just been put on the table, it would be helpful if that included an additional element, which is to request that the council delegate final decision making on the submission to the Regional Planning Committee's meeting on 3 May.
We'd have to do that. It's implicit in the resolution as it would be there.
It's implicit, but it would just explicit. Yep.
Any discussion?
Debates are late.
They're in debate, so you can't say.
We will say we'll make
Mr. Chairman, just to facilitate things, I'd move the remainder of the recommendations. That's 1 and 2. I suggest that 2.2 should read as outlined in the report and subject to feedback received at the meeting.
Mr. Chair, is there still scope to continue through the paper as is to make comment now, or are you deferring everything to?
I would say that given this short time frame and an opportunity for Tangata Whenua members, this is probably the only opportunity for us to share our views. I would say, I would encourage any expression of views and also that of the councillors. So that all need to be on the same page, so.
I've just got another suggestion for
Okay,
inclusion
yep.
in submission. That was all before we moved the
That's fine.
resolution. You're okay with that?
Yep.
If I could proceed to your section 64, your paragraph 64, and
Chair, we have a motion on the table.
Hasn't had a second been moved?
Oh,
Yeah.
well, you need to call for a second, ask for a second.
I second it.
No, we had another motion on the table.
This was to deal with the recommendations on page.
Deal with the recommendations on page 17.
My apologies, yes. Okay,
well,
second. We have a second.
I'm happy to second that.
Okay.
point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yep.
I don't believe we've finished considering the content and the opportunity to ask questions about the paper, and we're now moving to the recommendation. I'm just wondering about the opportunities lost there.
Are you willing to defer your motion for the moment while there's discussion on some?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Please proceed.
I think it's important to
Yeah, yeah.
continue with the paper.
Yeah, that's how I read it, but yeah,
Yeah.
carry on.
But I'm just wanting to suggest under that paragraph 64, the submission in relation to the Freshwater Improvement Fund, I wonder whether we make a comment around the assignment of vulnerable water bodies that the Ministry of the Environment have issued, that they do not coincide with our own assessment of vulnerability. Is it possible to include that as part of the submission?
Yes, we can do that.
Mr. Chair. Oh, just in I suppose tandem with Councillor Curtin, I too have a view on the fund, and I just would urge, and maybe it's a separate item or maybe it's a separate letter from the co-chairs. I don't believe we leverage the position of the RPC hard enough in Wellington. I mean, we're the only council that have taken this step, and frankly, the Pūtea coming north is pitiful, considering that tangata whenua, through the treaty groups and the council, are aligned around this table. And I'd urge, support financial assistance. I don't think that goes hard enough. I think they need to get the chequebook out, actually. And whether it's part of the submission or whether it's a separate letter, and I'll leave that up to the powers that be to suggest that we're not getting a fair suck of the sab when you see what the rest of the country's getting out of government for water quality improvement. I don't think we leverage hard enough. I'm talking in general, forget about the closing date. We're Hawke's Bay, we're together and we want some money. Thanks very much.
Well, I'm prepared to resubmit it. And there was I think. Yep.
Did you repeat most of it? So 2.2 is make a submission to the Ministry for the Environment in respect to the clean water discussion document as outlined in the report and subject to feedback received at the meeting.
Yes.
So, all in favour of the motion?
Aye.
Thank you. So that's the recommendations, and we move there. Agenda items. Item 7.
Thank you, Chair. This is our standing item to update the committee on the council plan change work program. So, look, I'll run through these